All right. Welcome to episode 10 now of the For My
Oh, I
Dogs
should do it too.
podcast.
Sorry, that was not intentional.
Yeah, you're
Sorry,
on
I had
for
to
a
get on
special episode.
Wow, I'm honored.
This is a
Honored.
milestone.
Number 10. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I didn't think we'd
And
make it this far.
as always, this is a podcast where we talk about what it's like to be a man in today's world and to highlight that we can't do it alone, that we need each other, we need community. And so for today, got my dog Johnny on as always. And then I also got my dog Taylor on, our very special, esteemed guest for the 10 episode.
Hey, there's a dog.
Wow, I'm
Yeah.
a dog. I've been grafted in. I'm part of the dog family.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
You are.
Just also, those are,
What is required?
Yes,
What does
please.
that require of me now? What responsibilities
When you
do I
become a
now have as a
dog,
dog?
you have to say an oath, and at the end of the oath, you have to bark. So that's what it
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually a blood oath too.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Okay,
that's
I'll
what it is.
consult
That's what it
with
is.
my lawyer.
Every guest has done it so far.
That's not true.
yeah.
That is not
No.
true. I've watched.
No.
Yes.
You tried to trick me there. I see.
Yeah.
I think we did that in middle school. We're like, hey, man, you should do this because everybody's done it. Me and one
That is
one's
true.
actually done it. That's
Yeah.
the cool thing to do.
Yeah. That is very true. So Taylor, for those that don't know, you're a good friend of mine. You're actually my boss there for a minute.
For a minute.
But I've always just, I guess it was longer than a minute. A couple
Not
years.
too long.
But,
Yeah.
huh?
Not
Yeah.
too long.
Yeah, but you were my boss and a friend to me at a time when I was going through a season of transition. And I just always appreciated just how graceful you were during that time and how you were there for me to support me and help me kind of think out loud and think through and process things. So yeah, we were catching up recently, and just in our conversation, I was like, man, I would love to have you on. And so I'm glad we finally got to make it happen. But for everybody, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, and I'll also give a quick plug for your podcast, which I think is phenomenal. Just listened to the new episode this week, and it was great.
Thanks.
But it's called The Learning Laborers, so you can talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm honored and privileged. And on the 10th episode, I didn't even know that was. That's great.
Big deal.
But I'm Taylor. I'm just turned 33 years old, which makes you feel a little bit old. But I'm a husband. Been married for about 11 years. I've got 3 kiddos who are 8, 7, and 5. Really fun ages. And I've been a pastor for about 7 years or so, and been in a full-time pastoral ministry for almost 10. So it's kind of been my vocational path. Studied biblical studies in college, did my master's in biblical studies, and I'm actually getting my doctorate in theological ministry. Right now, I should be graduating sometime next year or so. Gotta write my thesis still.
That's awesome.
But I've been able to kind of study under some of my mentors, a guy named Scott McKnight, Nijay Gupta, and Matthew Bates. So that's been a really fun thing that I've been a part of the past, I guess, 3 years or so. But that's kind of plays into a big passion of mine, which is trying to bridge this gap between learning and ministry. Really like kind of this academic scholarship pursuit, but also making sure that lands in a ministry space. And so that's why me and a buddy started the Learning Laborers podcast, where we just try to help bridge and facilitate that gap a little bit, to get people who are really invested in learning the Bible or learning ministry practices in the academic space and talk about how that affects their ministry. And so we're on episode 35 or something, which
Cool.
cool. We don't.
That's awesome.
We're not super consistent with it, maybe as much as you guys are, but we enjoy it. Like we really
Yep,
I have
triple
one.
the amount of episodes we
Yeah.
have. So you must be
Yeah, we're
somewhat
not as
consistent.
consistent, but we have more
I mean, we
episodes.
started a good bit of it. But yeah, I
Oh,
really
okay.
enjoy that, and we've had some really good guests on, and yeah, enjoy doing it. So yeah, it's kind of a basic introduction. Gives people a little bit of a flavor
Yeah,
for you.
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't.
So go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. First off, let's just go ahead and say what was awkward is you introduced me and I waved, but for everyone on Spotify, they're not going to hear that wave, so that was just an awkward
Yeah,
silence.
usually you say
Yeah, I
something.
know. I just decided not to, but not the move. I won't do that again. Sorry. Um, what? What? Speaking of just my awkwardness, I think Taylor, that you and I think we met like 6 years ago. I mean, that's how long Claire and I've been dating, so that's just why I'm assuming.
The problem.
And so I didn't realize that was your kind of like time period of being a pastor was like 7 years. So I didn't realize I've almost known you during that entire time.
Sure.
We never actually officially have hung out before. We just have talked in passing, but I've
Right.
always enjoyed
Yeah.
your sermons. Like I would
Thanks.
I was very interested in them because I like going deep into philosophy in that style. And I think your sermons would always tie that in together.
Man, thanks
So
for
happy
saying that.
6 year
Yeah,
friendship, Taylor, I guess.
There we go.
You
Yeah.
could say that.
Yes. Yeah.
and
That's great.
just to further, piggyback kind of on what you were saying, Taylor, like y'all's podcast, I feel like this is a unique way that the Lord's gifted you is you have the ability to do the work of learning, to take really like complex ideas and then make them understandable for people who haven't done all that research and done all that work. And so on the podcast, I mean, you guys don't shy away from talking about pretty big topics. Like you did a series on aliens, and I
Right.
just was fascinated by it.
Joe Rogan podcast
Okay.
over here.
Yeah. So yeah,
to
just
listen to
another reason to go listen to their podcast is you can hear about aliens and how that
Sure.
intersects with Christianity and the Bible. But yeah, Taylor, you're just last week on the podcast we talked about just the importance of humility, and we were talking about marriage, but just how humility is the beginning of the fear of the Lord, which Proverbs says is the beginning of wisdom. And just the entire time I've known you, man, like that's the best way I know how to describe you is you're wise. You're like a wise sage in my life. You're like my Gandalf. You're like my Gandalf.
Wow.
And
Wow.
are you Frodo?
I'll hold on to that.
I'd rather not be
Okay.
Frodo.
Wait, who are you then, Tucker?
I don't know. Not Frodo.
Okay.
I'd rather.
yeah.
I mean, if I'm gonna be a Hobbit, I'd rather be like Sam. Maybe
Sam.
Sam's pretty cool.
Okay.
Cooler than Frodo?
In the movies,
He's like
in
the
the
comic
movies.
relief in the movie. Like that's what Sam's character.
Yeah, but then he carries Frodo freaking up the mountain.
He does
Frodo
do
wouldn't have
that.
made it without Sam, dude.
And then he goes and he plays in Notre Dame after he helps Frodo out with Rudy.
That's right.
That's the multiverse
Sam's
with
a-
Rudy
Yeah.
and
Multiverse,
the
yeah.
Roots. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's good.
Right. Well, you mentioned that you're in a cohort for your doctoral degree. You guys just went on a pretty cool trip. Would you like to tell
Yeah.
everybody where you ventured to?
Yeah, so we went to Turkey and Greece. So part of my doctoral study, my degree is in New Testament context. So it really focuses on looking at the context of the New Testament, what's going on historically, socially, politically, even religiously around the time of the New Testament. So part of the degree requires a work study trip. And we were supposed to go to Israel. That's kind of where most of the things that we kind of study. We studied a lot of the background with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the social politics of like Judea area. But because of everything going on in Israel right now, they canceled that trip and moved it to Turkey and Greece. Do you know, like Turkey, what like what relevance that would have to like a New Testament study.
Yeah, that's where like Ephesus was. So
Right.
Ephesians. Yeah.
Yes.
Paul did a lot in Turkey, especially on
Yeah.
the coastal part, right?
Right. Along that coastal part. So a lot of people, when you say like, oh, Turkey in the New Testament, it doesn't really like register for them. But in many ways, Turkey was like the birthplace of Christianity in the New Testament early church, with Paul and a lot of his ministry there and travels. So we went to places like Smyrna, Sardis, Pergamum. A lot of these you can find kind of at the beginning of Revelation, the 7 letters to Revelation. You can find these
Oh, cool.
spots. Went to Ephesus. And then we went into Greece, went to Athens, Thessaloniki, Philippi, all those kind of places as well. And I mean, it was 14 days, and we went to a lot of these ancient sites just to kind of get a feel for what the world was like, for what the space was like,
Did you get to
geography was
go to
like.
the Parthenon?
We
Sorry, I
did,
didn't mean to cut you
yeah.
off.
So in Athens, no, you're
Did you
good.
really?
So in
That's cool.
Athens, yeah, we went to the Parthenon, and they're always working on the Parthenon, so you can't go in it, but it's
Oh,
pretty
really?
cool. It's pretty big.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Right
Yeah, a
on.
lot of these
I'm
sites,
studying.
what's funny, go ahead.
I'm studying Greece and Rome right now with my class I'm teaching, and so like
Sweet.
I love Greek mythology, and so the Parthenon, which is a temple dedicated to Athena, that's super cool.
Yeah.
That you actually went and
Yeah.
saw that. If you have pictures, I would love to see some.
Yeah, I'll be happy to show you some pictures. But yeah, Athens was cool. It's funny, once you go over there, we were visiting, maybe there's some days where we're visiting 4 sites a day. Um,
Yeah.
and then it's like a lot of these are sites, like they're not excavated a ton. So you're just looking at kind of a bunch of rocks around, but kind of gets old a little bit. You're like, oh, some more rock. Oh, another agora, another temple.
Don't
But
do that to history. You're killing me.
yeah, like
I'm the history teacher. You're killing me.
I'm sorry, Johnny.
Right.
But it was really cool. You get a really good feel for like the space and the reality of a lot of the travel, especially that Paul did. He was a traveling man for sure. So it was cool. It was really neat. Kind of put it on the ground a little.
Yeah, that was really cool. And I was actually shocked when you got back. I asked you which place had better food, and you actually said Turkey.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Turkey was
which
awesome.
I was shocked at because I feel like everyone raves about the food in Greece, but hey, apparently
I mean,
Turkey's got it going on.
They were both really good. I'm not gonna, but
Yeah.
Turkey was, I guess, more surprising to me, so maybe that's why it edged it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, also, we got to talk about Johnny's wearing a Braves hat today because he found out yesterday that you're a Yankees fan, which you guys just had a big win to move
Really good,
on.
man.
And there was a video of your son like in front of the TV pitching along with the Yankees pitchers, and
Yeah.
I loved it.
Oh,
That was just so cool.
Listen,
like I know,
yeah.
I know you're loving that as a dad.
how are you a Braves fan?
Dude,
I mean,
it's
how
so
are you a
much fun.
Yankees fan? Not
So
saying
my dad,
yeah, just how that happened.
it's pretty easy to be a Yankees fan because they're champions, John. I mean,
Oh, so
they're
we're a
awesome.
bandwagon. That's what I'm saying.
But no, not bandwagon. So my dad grew up in Jersey. He grew up
Okay.
in New Jersey, and kind of chose the Yankees over the Mets. And then I grew up, right? I was born in '91, so I grew up. My dad's a Yankees fan, and in the '90s, I mean, the Yankees were amazing. That was the era of like, Derek Jeter, Willie Pettit, Mariano Rivera, Jorge Posada. I mean, they were going to the World Series like every other year, mostly beating the Braves during that time, right? So
Okay.
it was just a
All
fun
right.
time. It was a fun time to be a Yankees fan, and it just like grabbed onto me, and kind of I can't let it go. So now I get to speak to your point, Tucker, with Hudson, my oldest. He loves baseball. I mean, he's hooked on it, and he's loving being a Yankees fan too. We've indoctrinated him my dad took me and him, so my dad, me, and Hudson to the first Yankees postseason home game on Friday or Saturday, last Saturday. And it was
Oh,
just
wow,
so much
cool.
fun. It was a great game. The Yankees won. Hudson was just flipping out, and it's a ton of fun. It's great to see him excited about it too. So it's been like a bonding thing for us.
And let's also
Yeah.
be clear that Tucker said I award this because you're a Yankees fan. I'm not trying to intimidate you because obviously we're no longer
That
in the
wouldn't work.
postseason.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Because I'm a Braves fan, and I'm used to disappointment being a fan of the Braves. So I definitely am
Right.
not. It's not intimidating. I mean, I got my shirt on. I got a
I seen
Braves
that.
cup going on. Like,
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
you went
I
all
went,
out.
That's
I
a
went
lot
all
of
out for you,
stuff.
man. I know.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
if there's an
But hey,
NL
welcome
team
through
that
it
I would
all.
cheer for, it would be the Braves because I mean
Okay.
they're kind of closest. And
If you were the Nationals, then we couldn't be friends. So at least you're a
okay.
Yankees fan. Then there's a difference with that.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's probably the first time we've ever. Well, maybe we've talked about baseball one other time, maybe because of the Braves, but we usually don't talk about baseball, so that's a good change of pace.
There we go.
But just to kind of transition, Taylor, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because one of the last times we were talking, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you were so helpful to me when I was going through a season of transition, and now kind of the roles have reversed, and you're experiencing your own season of transition. However, I don't feel like I've been able to help you and come alongside you the
No.
same way you did for me in that time. But yeah, do you mind just sharing a little bit, kind of about what that's been like for you and just what you feel like you're learning through that whole process?
Yeah, I mean that's a huge question, but I'll try and
Yeah.
trying to distill some things. Um, so just to give some background to your listeners, I was raised in the church that I've been serving in for the past decade. So I grew up at the church Lake Norman Baptist. Was baptized there as a kid, grew up, really kind of launched my spiritual journey of following Jesus at this church. Family saw a little, like, kind of what you could say, like rejuvenation at this church as well. My dad really started to follow Jesus at the church. And so this place has been special to me all the way back to when the Yankees were beating the Braves in World Series,
Right.
right? Like, there
Is
it
this going
is.
to be a full circle each time?
Every time I'm gonna bring it up.
Every time you get a
But
chance.
it's but so it's had this special place in my heart way back then. So when I graduated college and had the opportunity to come back on staff as kind of a middle school minister, it was an awesome opportunity. And I started to kind of get back involved with that local community, and that's where I've been the past decade. So about in total, I've spent almost 18 years at this church, and it's been such a formative place. It has nurtured me into becoming the follower of Jesus that I am and that I hope to be moving forward in so many ways. But also, kind of like that 18-year span, you can carry the metaphor. It's kind of been like a childhood. And over the past few years, it's been different things that God's been bringing into my life. Some is like just getting some more experience outside of that local church in my doctoral program, also just in some of my studies, but also just like thinking about what's next in the next stint of ministry. It's led me to start thinking about, what would it look like to leave the house and to kind of take a next step outside of kind of this childhood home and into an area of ministry that maybe I don't know yet. And so I started to kind of think about that, listen to the Spirit a little bit, or not a little bit, a lot of it, and just tried to start following what I sensed the Lord's leading would be, and came to a place in conversations with the leadership at the church. This wasn't like, horrible breakup or anything. It was like honest conversations, just, hey, it might be time for me to leave the house and to kind of think about what's next, and came to this place of, yeah, let's kind of build a transition plan for you to do that well, to end well, celebrating everything that's come behind you, and also looking forward to set you up for your next thing. And so that granted me a space up until like next May to start transitioning out of this role that I've been in and look for the next thing. So I'm kind of in this in between space of transition. And that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about all of this is, even though I prepared myself for this, even though I feel like this is the right thing to do, even though I sense that this is what the Lord is calling me to do and the Spirit's guiding me to do, it's been terrifying. It has been something
Yeah.
that has, in many ways, simple me. And
Yeah.
hit me way harder than I anticipated. Right? And I think it's for all the reasons that I shared. And like, this has been a place of belonging for me. It's been a place of nostalgia. It's been a place of growth and of development and of failure and of opportunity and all these things. And now I'm stepping out into the unknown. And it's the first major transition of my life, probably. More so than when I went to college. It just feels huge. And you couple that with, now I have a family, right, with 3 small
Right.
kids, and the responsibility that goes on to that. And I think because of all those things, my body was like, hey, you need to process this. You need to process this in a way that's taking it seriously. And so I started to have panic for the first time in my life. Never had a panic attack. And started to have this like body signaling of how serious of a transition this was. And it was scary. It was really scary. I never had that before. I don't know. I've talked to Tucker a little bit about it, but Johnny, have you ever had what you call a panic attack?
Like, I definitely have. I struggle with anxiety more than I do depression. And yes, I have had because I've been around friends during when they've had severe panic attacks, and so mine have not been as severe as the ones that I've witnessed, but I've had my own version of them that I just like my chest tightens so much, I'm freaking out. I don't know what to do if I just sit on the ground. I just like can't move, and like I've had those before, but but see, this is just me. I don't know. I see other people's, and I was like, well, mine wasn't as extreme as the other person. I'm not so
Sure.
like, yes, I have, but I think they're all different, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, especially having been in a ministry context and ministering to students for, almost a decade, I had been talking to them about dealing with anxiety for years. And like, I
Right.
had my assumptions of what anxiety was. Like, oh, you're just constantly worried about something. Like, you feel like you have a big to-do list or something like that. So I had thought that like I knew what people were saying when they had anxiety, panic. But when this hit
Oh,
me, it was
interesting. I
like,
gotcha.
oh, this is what a panic attack is. It is like,
Mm.
it's a lot darker and kind of scarier than I thought. It's like, it's almost like a mood that can just take over, where there's like this cacophony of thoughts that just stack on top of each other and then stick in your head and then overwhelm your body to the point where then, yeah, you start sweating, your heart starts racing, but also you feel kind of stuck.
Yeah, you
And,
like can't move.
right. And so that was a new thing for me. Um, and, I think
Which it makes
now
you
that I've
freak out
kind of,
more.
right,
Like
it can kind of
yeah.
spiral.
So like it makes it worse. Yeah.
And this is so for me, I came at it where, I'm a reader, I'm a learner. I've read on cognitive behavioral therapy, like CBT. I've read on practices to become present. I had read on stuff for anxiety and panic attacks. And so I'm sitting here, I'm like trying to process through and kind of work my way out of it. And I was like, what in the world is
Mm.
going on? And that was kind of the scary moment of just like, what is wrong with me? What, did I make a mistake? Did I mishear the spirit? Am I just like, spiraling out of my head a little bit. But now as I reflect on it, I think the way I process it now is yes, those things are real and scary. I think they're signals to the gravity of the decision that was happening. But it was also a prompting for me to slow down and settle in. And to say, hey, look, this is going to take some time. This is going to take some processing. This is going to take you instituting some healthy habits. To hear, for me, as a follower of Jesus, I was like, I need to get back into my body, as to trust my body and to hear the voice of the Spirit clearly. And so it kind of also prompted me to just take healthy habits really, really seriously. So, I'm not doom scrolling on social media much anymore. I'm in scripture devotionally a lot more than I ever have been. I'm going on runs or working out, lifting way more than I have been. I'm getting good sleep. I'm playing more guitar, silence and solitude, meditation. All these things have also been due to the fact that I was having those panic attacks. And so there's like this redemptive quality to it, where I'm almost glad that my body awakened me to the need to really process this in a healthy way or in a really intentional way. And so like I say now, like, yeah, I'm working out, I'm eating healthy, I'm trying to sleep better, but like I don't feel like I should take any credit for it, because if I don't do it, I feel like I'm gonna go crazy. It's almost like I'm driven to it, you know? But in that sense, I think it's been a grace that God's like almost pushed me to this place of intense health and trying to just focus on being healthy. And yeah, that was a lot of
You
work
took that
on
into a
it.
positive. Like where like
Yeah,
most people, like if they get that, that can cause them to stay there. But you took that as a sign to like, let's reevaluate that. And so like that's really impactful, because I mean, just taking that as a sign instead of as a step back that's huge.
yeah,
Yeah. Because I remember too, when we first talked about this, Taylor, I remember you, kind of talking through how you had no idea where it was coming from most of the time.
Mhm.
Like sometimes it just felt like it was like popping out of nowhere. Um, but like hearing you now say, as you've reflected on it more, you see it as kind of like almost like a warning sign or an alarm going off. Like, hey, you need to, you know, let's start moving in a healthier direction. And we've talked before on the podcast just about like mind, body, and spirit all being connected, and kind of thinking of it
Yeah,
as like a three-legged stool. Like if
yeah,
you're missing a leg, that stool is not going to be sturdy. Or if one's shorter than the other legs, then you're going to be wobbling around. Um, and so that's interesting to hear you say that. And I was just meeting with a pastor just yesterday, and he said something when we were talking that just has been going through my mind. But he said we all have a choice to be uh, built or broken by everything in life.
Like,
And he was going through something particularly challenging in his life, and he was like, I'm choosing to be built by that. And it sounds like that's the choice you've made with experiencing these panic attacks, is not taking
sure.
it as a source for shame or guilt or something like that, but you're taking it as, no, this is the Lord trying to get my attention to make me a better man, a better human.
Right.
And so you're choosing to be built by that, which I think is powerful.
I
Yeah,
like
I
that
think you
quote.
got to. Yeah, that's a good quote. Yeah. I've been studying for my thesis. I'm doing a lot of work in First Peter, and right at the beginning of First Peter, right, he's writing to a community that's suffering, that's getting ostracized, that's felt totally disinherited, that they just don't feel like they have any belonging in the space that they're in. And one of the things that Peter does on the front end of this letter is he acknowledges that. He acknowledges that that's real, right? Like the struggle that you're in, the suffering that you're in, the trials that you're facing, those are real. But then he redeems them by doing a few things. One, he situates them kind of in this deeper reality to say, yeah, you're disinherited now, but guess what? You have an imperishable inheritance. And so he's like, you need to see through these things to a deeper reality where what you're longing for in this life is only going to be fulfilled in Jesus. And so I think when we go through struggles or, trials, those things can expose false realities in our life. And then secondly, I think what Peter does is he also redeems the trials. And he says, something's happening in this trial to refine you. Something's happening in this to work something out that could not have been worked out without the fire, right? It's like gold. Gold gets refined in fire. And so I think that's the perspective that I'm trying to carry into the suffering that I'm going through. It's real. It's something that's truly happening. But at the end of the day, like, this isn't the end of my story. I'm not going to be suffering from anxiety for the rest of eternity with Jesus. And in the meantime, it can do something to redeem and refine my service to him now. And so just laboring in that is kind of the place that I'm living.
Yeah. Well, I also think just you in this moment right now is a powerful example of like you going through this and then talking about your journey through it can likely help someone else who's experiencing the same thing. And so it's not only does going through challenging things like this refine us, but God can also use it to provide like help in a needed time for others as well. So it's, it just goes, I think a lot of times suffering tends to cause us to look inward and to forget what's going on a larger scale. But just hearing you saying all that you're saying right now just reminded me like, yeah, there may be somebody listening to this who's been struggling with panic attacks for a while, and maybe they've never thought of it as, oh, this could be trying to get my attention, and maybe they'll go down that path of trying to figure out what it might be saying, or so I think that's really a really cool part of this too.
Kind of piggyback off what Tucker's saying, and also talk about your role as a pastor, Taylor. Many pastors, the expectation is to have everything under control always, right? I know that's not true, but that may be the expectation that a pastor may put on themselves. So do you think that with that expectation that causes a lot of mental health struggles with pastors or just people in the church as well?
Yeah. Look, pastoring is a really difficult calling place of service. I think we shouldn't sugarcoat that. It's really difficult. One recent survey, maybe I can pull it up in my notes. But one recent survey, I think it was out of the Hartford Institute, said something like half of pastors have thought about quitting in the past year. That's a high turnover rate. But there's like 250,000 working pastors in America right now, and more than half of them work 40 to 60 hours a week, and a quarter of them work 60 plus hours a week. So they're working pretty crazy hours. And then you add to this that they report higher rates of depression than the U.S. average. Pastors do. They report higher rates of job dissatisfaction and job distress than the U.S. average. And that's a lot of times because they have this huge amount of expectation on them that spans a wide area of responsibilities. There was a guy who wrote, he resigned maybe his last year, and he wrote this long letter explaining why he resigned as a pastor. And he cited 7 role expectations of every pastor. And it was like, you've got to be a professional speaker. You've got to be a CEO. You've got to be a counselor. You've got to be a fundraiser. You've got to be a human resource director. You've got to be a master of ceremonies for weddings and funerals and worship services. But the last thing he says is you also have to be a pillar of virtue. And I pulled up this quote from it, but he said, "You're expected to be a pillar of virtue, meaning you must be blameless or morally pure. Your spouse and your children should be all perfect or close to it. Most importantly, you must be unconditionally loving, meaning you have to love everyone in your congregation and show them grace and forgiveness no matter how poorly they treat you." So it goes on, and there's a little bit of cynicism. You can even sense it in the way he's writing. There's a little bit of cynicism. I think that's just because that's the reality of a lot of the expectations that are put on pastors. And they're carrying this. And they're carrying this a lot in the name of suffering for Jesus, which is really dangerous. It's good, but it's also really dangerous because it can perpetuate a vicious cycle of endless unhealth, where you're trying to carry way more than you can. All in the name of doing it for Jesus, you're doing it for the sheep. And I think one of the things that will cause is mental health issues. It will cause spiritual health issues. It will cause physical health issues. It will just cause health issues in general. And so I think what pastors need to kind of realize is that it's never faithful to be unhealthy. It's a matter of faithfulness. What's what I say? In order to be faithful, we also have to balance being healthy. Yes, there's seasons where you got to suffer with the sheep and suffer for the sake of the sheep. Absolutely. But we have to also be very vigilant that we're not entering into long seasons of unsustainable unhealth. Because it's going to cripple you and your ministry if you do that. So I think that's a perspective that pastors need to have to help with mental health. And then secondly, congregations need to help out here. I think the church needs to look to their pastor and stop expecting them to do all 7 of those things. Right? The church has to look at a pastor and say, you know what? You went to seminary. You don't also have to be a human resources teacher. And or if so, you got to figure out how to structure this thing differently. The church doesn't need to be a commercialized business in these senses. So I think there's a real expectation and pressure that pastors are going to have to fight against. But also the congregation and the church needs to help out by not putting those expectations and carrying some of those expectations themselves, or else you're going to have mental health, spiritual health issues.
Yeah. And it's almost like hearing you talk about it. It's this like both and, because I think the temptation for pastors a lot of times. Yeah, I do sound like Johnny. Can't talk today. But I think the temptation for pastors a lot of time is to take that expectation from the congregation, and instead of just I feel like pastors, including myself, take that expectation and try to meet it, because it's almost like this pride that wells up, like, oh yeah, I can be that for these people. I can do that, and I need to do that. So I'm gonna live up to that. But then I think that prevents the pastor from being honest and authentic. And that's one of the things I've always appreciated about you and your ministry, Taylor, is you stayed true to who you were, no matter what the expectations were. You stayed faithful to who God has wired you to be. And I think more pastors need that. Like if we are part of the flock too, and we expect our congregation to be honest and authentic about what they're struggling through so that they can heal and they can start to move towards Jesus and begin to let him form and shape them and help them, then we should be doing the same. It does no good for our congregation if we are trying to present ourselves as something that we're not.
Right.
And so it's like this. It's a two-way street, because the expectations, we should be trying to train up congregations to not have those expectations of their pastor, but it's almost like the expectations are perpetuated because the pastor feeds into it. a lot of
Yeah.
times, or at least that's just kind of how I'm thinking about it right now.
Right. Right. And I think,
I was wondering.
that's
I'm
where,
sorry.
go ahead. No,
No, no,
there's a
no.
little
You
bit
go.
of a
I
lag.
didn't know you
So
were
I'm like,
responding. Yeah, no, I didn't know you were responding.
Yeah.
You go for it.
that's where I think this is the only way to get at this is the two-way street, like you said, because in as much as pastors are put in positions where they have those expectations, faithfulness will be tied to meeting those expectations. And so I think there's something about what we're expecting from the congregation side that's going to help them be more faithful, or help pastors be more faithful. And there has to be this give and take. And, I've been compelled recently, this is Acts 6 or Acts 7, where it talked about, you have this issue with the Hellenistic widows. But you had this problem come up in the early church community, where the Hellenistic widows, the Greek-speaking widows, are not being taken care of. So they go to the apostles, the leaders at that time, and they say, "Hey, this issue needs to be solved." And they're like, "You're right. This is an issue. It's a problem." But they have this discernment and the audacity, in some sense, to say, "But it's not our problem to solve." They say, "We
Oh,
need to teach the
right.
word and pray." And so what they do is they say, "We want you to elect leaders to deal with this problem." And then I think one of the most beautiful things is they elect Greek-speaking people to deal with it. They elect the people who the problem was affecting to actually deal with the problem. And I just haven't been able to get that kind of paradigm out of my head, though, because what that shows is a leadership that respects their boundaries, but also a community that they're going to empower with true power and influence
Mm-hmm.
to deal with those other things. So they also give up their power in that regard. They
Mm-hmm.
give it up to the group that they offended, the group that they had wronged. So that's like a both and, right? Like you've got this congregation that says they have a
Mm-hmm.
problem, they take it to the leaders, and then you have the leaders saying, "Okay, we're going to give this problem back to the congregation," and they give them power to deal with it. So I think that's what's needed, both of them.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I remember when you preached the sermon on that passage, and that really stuck with me. Like, and people talk about it in the business world all the time too. But it's the more you can delegate, the more
Sure.
you're actually empowering. Whether it's your fellow employees or you're in a church setting, you're empowering those people to do what they are capable of. And too often, the human tendency is to look to the leader to say, "No, you fix it." And the challenge for leaders is to be like, "Yeah, I am going to be the guy to fix it," rather
Right.
than saying, "Oh, no, I have people who are capable, who God has gifted with gifts and abilities. They can take care of this." And that's actually a good thing for them. It's not that you're shunning work or responsibility,
Yeah.
but you're shepherding them. You're
Right.
pastoring them by that delegation. So I think that's good. That's something that I struggle with.
Oh,
Because
I will raise my
as
hand too.
pastors, we just want to help. So like someone comes
Right.
to it with us that has a
Right.
problem, we're just like, "Oh yeah, I'd love to figure out how to help," rather than like, I don't know. It's just always hard to think outside of that way to say,
Uh-huh.
"Well, what could you maybe do about it? What are some solutions you could put together?"
I've never I'm not a pastor, and I've always just thought, man, the congregation is putting so much weight on the pastors. I've never thought of the point of view, maybe some of our listeners haven't either, of, I mean, the congregation has their part too. However, the pastors are the ones accepting it, because they feel like they have to. And that's just like an interesting thing. Not blaming the pastors, because I can't imagine being in that role
Right.
and feeling like you have to. But y'all right. It's like it's an and, like it's an and. It's not an or, right? And Taylor, I kind of want to go back on this like and part, is that we said on the podcast before that mental health is both like medical and spiritual. And so with this and thing, is sometimes with mental health, some people need medical help with it as well. What would you say to the Christians who say, no, it's only spiritual, it's not medical?
Oh, yeah.
Question.
Very easy question. I guess I'll give a push and a pull. I do think, um, one, for one, we have separated the physical and the spiritual. We have this dichotomy um, in a lot of ways that just needs to be broken down across the board. We are embodied beings made by God to inhabit physical space, and our end at the end of the age is not an ethereal, spiritualized body. It's embodied again in a new creation. And so I think our bodies matter. That and me personally, I haven't been always good at that. I think the evangelical tradition has been good at that either. Maybe some other Christian traditions are. But I think that plays into a little bit of how we think of this issue of mental health or bodily health as it relates to spiritual health. We separate them as this complete thing. And I think it's more intertwined or more entangled um, than we can tend to realize. Now, in terms of getting assistance or help with mental health issues, I do want to say, at least from my experience, one of the last things that I wanted to do was to rush the process of working through some of these things by turning to, say, medication or to a psychiatrist or whatever. That was just my disposition. I've never really been in real counseling settings or like clinical counseling settings, so that wasn't my default. It wasn't kind of my cultural pressure either. But also I felt like there was something, like I said earlier, like God was signaling through these things, and I wanted to kind of sort through them in my own kind of discernment and leaning into conversations, leaning more into habits and research that I had. Now, a lot of that dealt with bodily things like working out, eating healthy, sleeping right, caffeine intake down, right? All these things. Like it was bodily things in as much as more time in prayer, worship music when I run instead of, other music. I don't know, whatever music you um, but like there's also spiritual practices um, that I emphasize as well. But I just see those all as intertwined, right? I see all of
Mhm.
those things as connected because God ministers to me as an embodied creature. Um, and I think where things get a little dicey or testy or controversial is when you start talking about like medications, right? And getting on certain medications. And that's not my, like I never felt like I was beyond the point of finding habitual help to seek those things out. I think those people have been through certain traumatic experiences that maybe that help is needed. But I hope that that's a process that they're discerning after trying to sort through some things, or in a community of people that can help them discern those things. I don't think or I would hope it's not your first term, right? It's to just get on some sort of medication. But again, that's my anecdotal experience. I don't want to push that or impress that as kind of like a general rule for anybody, especially if you've gone through something super traumatic and your body is just like shutting you down. Like there might be a role for you just to get your brain back on track in order to start practicing those healthy habits. I don't know. That's not my area of expertise, but that's kind of my pastoral word for it.
No, you're good. I mean, like, you're not going to take Advil if you don't have a headache. Like, don't take Advil just for a random reason, right? So, like, in the same way with this, yeah, right. So, like, so the same way for medication, like Cole came on a few episodes ago, and he spoke about how he tried everything, and he still wasn't getting the results with his
Right.
anxiety, and he went to a professional help and ask them, hey, what do you think? Like he did all the research on that and it was like, okay,
Right.
do this. And so like it's not this like, okay, now because I'm being anxious, my first step is going to do that. And after like I think we're all wired differently. So for some people that might be, but I agree, like
Sure.
think it through. Like it's medication's a big deal. So think it through, talk to professional help with it. But like I think there's just like with mental health, it's such as there's this like I don't think the church is educated enough sometimes in it, and we just shut it down. And we're just like, no, that's like it has to all be spiritual. And if you are doing medical at any point, then you're doing it wrong. But like God made doctors, and God gave them the wisdom to make this medicine, and so like I just sometimes I get a little frustrated with Christians when they have that
Yeah.
side. But your point, Taylor, like I definitely understand having guidance, going through this the professional way, do what you can, right? So like I think there's both on that, like to your point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think at the
Yeah.
end of the day, there is very rarely a clear universal prescription for anyone's problem. And sometimes that's radical for us to say as Christians because we think the Bible is just this answer book that gives us universal principles that applies to everyone, everywhere, all the time. I just think that's, if you really probe into that, it's extremely rare.
Mhm.
Well, no, not extremely rare. There's some clear things that you should not do, right? But when you're trying to wrestle through a gray area or a difficult, complicated issue, all I would say is take a breather, look to Scripture, posture your heart to the Lord, and then talk in community with trusted brothers and sisters in Christ to discern what you think is best based on who Jesus is and what he wants for your life. And I think if that's a mental health issue, if that's a job decision issue, if that is a, whatever decision you're making in life, that's a good posture to have. And I would say that's the same thing with mental health struggles. Does that make sense? I don't know
Right.
if that's super
No, yeah,
controversial or
to your
not.
point, like no, it like the Bible doesn't say like the Bible does not say the word mental health. That doesn't mean that it doesn't help. Like that doesn't mean it's not true. Just like the Bible doesn't say the word penguins, that doesn't mean penguins aren't real. So like it's a little like extreme version, but
I
like
don't know.
just because
Have
the
you
Bible isn't
seen
like
one?
yeah,
I mean,
true, true. I've never
I have.
yeah.
I've been to a zoo before,
Are those
so
real? Are pandas real?
are they
I don't even want to get
real,
down that road.
Tucker?
Yeah, are birds real? Are birds on telephone poles charging? That's the whole thing. Yes. Yes. Hey,
now hold on. We're not turning
no,
into
okay,
a
because I
conspiracy
could, because I
theory
had a roommate in
podcast.
college who was like that. I'll pause. So never mind.
But yeah. So kind of piggybacking on what you said, Taylor, and you too, Johnny. Taylor, you and I have had a bunch of conversations about just how the way of Jesus, the practices of Jesus, are a strategy for mental healing and dealing with
Sure.
mental health issues, and how powerful these practices are. And so I'm wondering if you can just speak into that a little bit, and also just into, so many young pastors I just had a pastor ask me this question, so I'm just reflecting it to you now so you can answer it. But so many young pastors, and this was my story, starting out in ministry, they get going, they're in it for, I think the average tenure of a youth pastor, which is usually where someone starts out in ministry, is a year and a half. And so they're getting in it and they're not staying in very long before they're leaving and doing something else. And usually what they'll cite is burnout, which, in my case, it was burnout and struggling with my sense of purpose. And then in the middle of that, just kind of started struggling with a form of depression. But how do you think the way of Jesus, the practices of Jesus, can not only help someone who's having mental health struggles, just in general, but also for these young pastors starting out at ministry? What do you think are some of the wisdom that Jesus has for those situations? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big
So take your
two-part
time.
question. Big two-part question there. I think, okay, so the first slice. What does the way of Jesus have to offer for mental health struggles? I've heard a definition of mental health. I forget where I heard it, but that's always resonated with me. Mental health is a commitment to reality at all costs. It's a commitment to
That's
reality at
good.
all costs.
I like that.
I believe the way of Jesus is the only access to true reality. I think what is most real in this world is a crucified king who loves you. And so, inasmuch as you have committed yourself to follow this king, you've seen him in his glory, and you've seen him in his love for you, and you've seen him in the way of life that he's lived. That compels you to true, abundant life. And inasmuch as
Mm.
you follow his pathway, I think you will find true life and a commitment to reality that will sustain your mental health. I believe that. I truly believe it. I can testify that that's been the anchor for my soul over these past few months. And I think we need to give people an inspiring vision of what that's all about. And so I think that easily segues into what young pastors or new pastors need to prioritize as well. At the end of the day, what pastoral ministry should be about is modeling the way of Jesus in front of those you're leading to live the way of Jesus. Your first priority as a pastor is to become what you're pointing people to. It's your first priority.
Mm.
And if there's any sort of responsibility that gets in the way of that, then it's going to be problematic for your ministry. Where you're going to get sideways. Ministry is going to become about other things. So inasmuch as the Christian life is all about becoming more like Jesus, becoming like the King that loves you, then young pastors, what we need to start them out focusing on is becoming like Jesus. I think we saddle young pastors with way too much responsibility because oftentimes they have the energy, the intensity, and the charisma to do it. And often older pastors are tired, worn out, and burnt out. And they're they're happy to see a young pastor come along willing to do it. And I just think we need to play the slow game, play the long game, which is letting these pastors, young ones, be in like an apprenticeship type model. And that apprenticeship needs to be focused on formation into the character of Jesus before it's ever about formation into the organizational leadership of the church. Those things need to come too, absolutely. But there's a priority there that I think will go a long way in helping these guys be more sustainable. And I just also think, as someone right now, I'm 33, thinking about what's next for me. I think there's just too many young pastors out there who are leading congregations that maybe have no business leading a whole congregation.
That's funny.
I don't feel like I'm in a spot to lead a whole congregation. I'm still learning so much and trying to become more like Jesus each day. But I think, there's some wisdom in having an old, wise sage and shepherd guy at a church, if it started off right. So I think curbing some of their responsibilities and giving them space to observe and to become is
Yeah. And you and I have talked about that before. Like, I think churches, not all churches, some churches have just gotten so complex and complicated. And we need like a return to simplicity so that pastors have the space for what you're talking about, to prioritize discipleship to Jesus, but also to prioritize deep relationships where they can share what they're struggling with, where they can talk about what they're going through, where they can learn from an older pastor who's been there, who's done it, who's has the wisdom of the season that the young pastor's in. And you were that for me. And I know that a lot of pastors get into ministry and they're not lucky enough to have that. But I think even though I had you, I wasn't investing in other relationships outside of the church that gave me a space to talk and to grow and to learn. I felt like my whole world was this church. And
Right.
I think it is really healthy for pastors to have community. Yes, they should have community at the church they're serving at, but it's also, I think, a really healthy thing to have community outside of that as well.
Yeah. I agree
I
with
guess I'm
that
just chopped liver over here.
100%.
Yeah.
Oh, poor Johnny.
I mean,
What'd you say,
I
Johnny?
said, I guess I'm just chopped liver over here. You didn't have
No,
anybody
you're part
outside of the
of
community. I'm just giving you a hard time.
you're part of the community I got outside of that eventually, but we've talked about before on here that I didn't share a lot when I was going through that with you,
Right.
so that's not your fault. That's my fault.
I had to get you back because, like, the past 2 episodes, when I try to say something serious, you always come after me in the middle of that. So I had to come at you at some point.
Hey, I will say, that part last week made Haley laugh out loud listening to the podcast, which does not happen often.
Oh,
So
heck yes. That makes it.
so it was worth it. It was
There
worth
we
it.
go.
Yeah. Well, Taylor, man, can't thank you enough for all you've shared so far. But just as kind of a closing thought, what's something you would say, or like a piece of advice, or just your 2 cents you would give to somebody who is maybe going through a season of transition right now, or maybe they're thinking about going through a big change or transition in their life? What would you kind of share to them right now?
Yeah. Yeah. Even though you sent me these questions beforehand, I did not think it through.
That's
I
good. I
think,
love off the cuff.
Yeah.
transition is an interesting kind of season because it's also a very normative season in Scripture. It's normalized often. And what I mean, or it's featured often in Scripture. If you think about the people of Israel, right? God could have taken them from the land of Egypt and their slavery and brought them to the promised land. But he has them wander in the desert. Now, part of this is because of their unfaithfulness, but also because there's things that they will need to learn and to become in order to occupy the land and to be in the land. Same thing with Jesus. Jesus, he gets baptized, and then where does the Spirit drive him? The Spirit drives him into the wilderness for 40 days. One, I think, to mimic the story of Israel, but also because it's this place of becoming. It's this liminal space that helps you kind of discern what's really, really important in life. It gives you some distance as to hear the voice of God. One of the things that's interesting is that, again, First Peter refers to this group as foreigners and as exiles. And there's some debate with scholars whether that's literal or metaphorical. Is he talking to literal people who are displaced or not? But I think you can make a case that it's a metaphorical identity that Peter wants them to live as foreigners and exiles, because that's our whole life. Our whole life is this exilic place of not really belonging in this world as it is. And so, in many ways, we're all going through a transitory time. We're all in liminal space as followers of Jesus. We're not yet home, but we also have seeds of what home will be like. We have pockets of heaven on earth that we can look forward to, but we're all in a place of transition. We're all in a place kind of figuring things out. So I think that helps. That's helped me to think that, okay, this is part of it. This isn't like, this isn't a curveball to God's work in me, right? In fact, this is something that maybe God wants me to lean into as to discover more of who I need to be and what I need to prioritize going forward. And so if you're in a season of transition, I would just encourage you to lean into that place and see what God wants for you in that season, because God's not one. Um, God is actually one to lead people into those seasons, as He did with the Spirit and sending Jesus into the wilderness. He's not. This isn't like a detour to God's plan for your life. It could be the preparatory stage to get you to where He wants you to be. And so that's
Yeah.
kind of at least the redemptive thread in my perspective right now, and maybe that could be someone else's too.
Yeah, I resonate with that 100%. And to our point earlier, you can be built or broken by everything,
Yeah.
and you can choose to be broken by a season of transition, or you can choose to be built by it. And I agree 100%. Like, it's not a detour; it's part of the race. Like God, I think God takes us through seasons of transition. To your point, to be formed, to be built up, for Him to do a work in us, but also to help us gain some perspective, to gain wisdom. I think is
Right.
part of why we go through seasons of transition. So I don't think they should be looked at as a negative thing, but as just part of our life here on earth. And I love that you pointed out that it's a regular feature in Scripture. Like, it's because of that, it's almost shocking that we're so like surprised and taken back when we go through a time of transition. But yeah, I just appreciate you a ton, Taylor. Thank you for coming on and
Thanks,
for taking the time to do this. And yeah, thanks for all you shared. And for our listeners, as always, be like Taylor. Go be a dog today.
And be like Taylor and go be there for your dog.